All right, Matthew 5:18. Let me read it in the Hebrew.
Yes.
He said, and here we have some slight differences between the manuscripts. And let's see, do we have any major ones here? They're not really major. There's some, pretty minor things here. So he says, "Be'emet ani omer lachem," in emet, in truth, I say to you, ki od od shamayim is one version, but ad sheyamushu shamayim va'aretz, until the heavens and earth are removed. Ot achat unukuda achat lo tivutal, or titbatel in some, mehatorah or menevi'im, shakol yitkayem. In truth, I say to you that until the heavens and earth are removed, one ot, one letter, unikuda achat, and one dot will not be canceled from the Torah or the prophets, for all will yitkayem, will be fulfilled, or literally will be preserved, will stand.
Preservation.
Wow.
Why would I get so excited about that? One, you said to me back then, this is years ago, you said, Keith, in the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew, it has these two words.
Yeah.
And that's why you actually sent me this original.
Yeah.
Because I wanted to see it for myself.
Photocopy the original.
But photocopy of the original. I'm sorry, photocopy of the original. But why were those two words such a big deal?
So in Hebrew, the consonants are written as a series of, as 22 letters. And then we have a series of dots and dashes, which are called nikudot, or nikud, which means dots, or pointing, dotting. And those dots provide the vowels. It's actually not just the vowels. It's things that in Hebrew we call vowels. I mean, we call them nikudot, dots. But they're things that are beyond vowels. Like, for example, the difference between a sheen and a seen is whether the dot's on the right side of the letter or the left side of the letter. Whether something has... whether the letter is pronounced b or v, or k or ch, and that applies to 6 specific letters. If they have a dot, they have a hard sound. If they don't have a dot, they have a soft sound. So that's not technically a vowel, but it's part of the nikud or the nikudot system, the dot system. It's called dots. So when you read this in Hebrew, ot achat, and look, dots could be anything. But when you hear about ot, which is letter, alongside dot, well, that's the dot system. That's the vowels. So really, this should be translated, literally, it's one letter and one dot will not be canceled from the Torah or the prophets, but that means one letter or one vowel.
Somebody's got to challenge this. Nehemiah.
They should challenge us.
Yeshua speaking way back in the 1st century. There were no Masoretes, Nehemiah. Are you saying? Are you saying that? Are you saying that Yeshua's reading the Masoretic text that's got vowel markers? What are you saying?
Well, I guess we need to define what the Masoretic text is for those who don't know.
Absolutely.
And it could mean different things in different contexts. So the text that we have of the Bible in Hebrew, that is the Tanakh, the Old Testament, is called, the standard text is the Masoretic text. Comes from the word Masorah. Masorah means transmission. In other words, in English you'll say, or I guess it's not English, it's Latin, the textus receptus, right? The received text. The Masorah is the transmitted text.
Yes.
And that is the standard text. It doesn't matter if you open up your BHS Bible over there, printed by Germans in Stuttgart, or you open up the Jerusalem Crown, printed in Jerusalem, Israel. Every one of those texts will be 99.999% identical. They'll be identical in the consonants, the vowels, and the accents. There will be slight differences here and there that if you're an expert, you can identify. Some of those have to do with the name, but there'll be slight, it doesn't matter. Any text from, basically, that's been printed from 1524, when they made the Second Great Rabbinical Bible, up until today is going to be virtually identical. And in fact, if you open up any manuscript from that was written by hand, going back at least 1,000 years, it'll be nearly identical. And that's called the Masoretic text. Now, one of the features of the Masoretic text is there is this obsession, and it's, I think, correct to call it an obsession, with every little feature of the text.
Yes.
And what do I mean by that? Let me give you an example. So, and how are we doing on time here? Wow.
We're good. No. It's okay. It's okay.
No, I don't even. There's so much depth to this. So let me give you an example. there are a number of places in the Tanakh, in the Masoretic text.
Yes.
And let me back up. When we say the Masoretic text, this is as opposed to the non-Masoretic text. The non-Masoretic text would be, for example, some of the manuscripts found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. I did a teaching on this, an interview I did with the top expert in the world, Professor Emmanuel Tov, called The Bible of the Dead Sea Scrolls or something like that. And so he has this category he calls QSP Plus, which is Qumran Scribal Practices Plus. And there you have, for example, first 1Q Isaiah 8, 1Q Isaiah A, the first Isaiah scroll from Qumran, is not a Masoretic manuscript. It has major differences from the Masoretic text. And what do I mean by major? It's not that major, right? But it's differences in the details.
Yes.
And sometimes it's differences even in the level of words, and in some occasions, like when you get to Jeremiah, it could be like very significant differences. But most of it is differences of what we call orthography. And what do I mean by orthography? So the rabbis had this idea that they started out with this: God doesn't waste our time, and God doesn't just speak the way we speak. When I speak, I can repeat myself, and I say and ooh, or if I'm speaking Hebrew, I say I want to tell you. So the Jewish approach, and especially the rabbinical approach, was that every single letter had significance.
Yes.
And to the point where there were rabbis who elaborated entire homilies, entire explanations of whether a word was spelled one way or another. And let me try to give an example of this. So in English, we have words that can be spelled multiple ways.
Yes.
And that depends whether you're American or you're British. So let's say, an example I love is the word color. C-O-L-O-R in America, and in England they say C-O-L-O-U-R. So the rabbinical approach is, well, if it's spelled with the U has the numerical value of such and such, and that represents this entire thing, and they can even derive laws and practices based on the spelling. Famous example is that there are these 3 extra letters, and by extra letters I mean letters that you could have done without. They don't change the meaning. And those spell out the letters mem, yud, mem, they spell out the word water. And the rabbis derive a certain ceremony from these letters in Leviticus 23, I believe it is. Or maybe it's 28, Numbers 28, 29, I don't remember. And so well, wait a minute, and you have to understand, in languages, up until modern times, they didn't have standardized spelling. So it's famously, Shakespeare spelled his name like a half a dozen different ways in his own writings. He didn't know how to spell his name. It's not that he didn't know. There was no standard way of writing his name. It really could be written in different ways, right? It's kind of like the Hebrew word Hanukkah. I've seen it written CH, just with an H, with one N, 2 N's, 1 K, 2 Ks. And it's not that one of those is wrong. It's that it's not an English word, right? So we don't have the standardized spelling for it. So up until really until printing, there wasn't a standardized spelling for Hebrew, for English, for Latin. There were certain standards, right? But if you spelled, an example I love is the word Sukkot. Sukkot could be spelled legitimately in 4 different ways. And there's an example in one verse in Genesis where it's literally spelled 2 different ways in the same verse. Nothing to do and that doesn't change the meaning. It's just 2 different ways to spell the same thing. So the rabbi would say, if you spelled it this way versus that way, that we have some hidden meaning that's meant to be encoded there. I don't believe there's a hidden meaning encoded there, but the presupposition for that approach is that the spelling has been fixed, not for that word across the text, but that word in that specific verse and that specific part of the verse. So that when they reproduce the Bible, every single Bible should have the word spelled this way in this verse and that way in the other verse. Right, now why is that important? It tells us that by around the year, I think we can say by the destruction of the temple, 70 AD, based on rabbinical sources, that the text of Scripture was fixed down to the letters. And what we learned from the Dead Sea Scrolls is that there's a category of manuscripts which scholars call Proto-Masoretic text, What does Proto-Masoretic mean? It means Masoretic before we thought the Masoretic text existed. Right? The early form of the Masoretic text, it exists at a time before it should exist. And how do they know about the Proto-Masoretic text? Because we can see that the text has been corrected in some of these Dead Sea Scrolls.
Yes.
And how do we know it's corrected? They write a little letter above the line. They make little changes that don't change the pronunciation, don't change the spelling. They're entirely about that word has to be spelled this way in this verse, and it's not spelled that way, so we're going to fix it. Okay, so what that tells you is that the Hebrew text that we have of the Bible already existed in the time of Yeshua.
Yes.
And it was already considered by at least some Jews to be a text that was fixed down to the very letters. Even where it was a matter of spelling.